I was proud, and it remains a great pleasure to have been a friend and a colleague and to have been advised by Anna in the course of my working life and in a variety of ways. She gave sage advice to a project that my colleague Bill Lucas and I ran for creativity, culture and education on how to track and evidence the development of creative mindedness in children in schools. I had wonderful discussions with her and with Rupert at Exeter University. They were kind enough to put me up for a visiting professorship there some years ago, and to work with her on the book that we did with Howard Gardner, which was again a great pleasure in both those roles. That book had its origins in a memorable conference that Anna and others organised here at Cambridge some 10 years ago now, I think. So it's fitting that although this is being formally hosted by the University of Exeter, we should be back here in Cambridge to celebrate and continue the work that Anna was so seminal in developing. It's daunting to be walking and speaking in Anna's shadow. It's also a little daunting to be speaking in front of her family, and I'm very grateful and touched and honoured to be able to speak on her work and on her behalf with you in the room. I'm also a little daunted to be following in the footsteps of the first Anna Craft Memorial lecturer, Ken Robinson, who by any standards is a bit of a hard act to follow. I remember a couple of years ago at the Sunday Times Festival of Education at Wellington College, where they saved up Ken Robinson and an eminent American researcher called Carol Dweck to give the two concluding talks on the second afternoon of that conference. Ken was his usual incisive, elegant, and very witty self. And there was a small pause between the two presentations. And then Carol Dweck, who, if any of you have seen her talk, is a small, she's always dressed in black, small, rather bird-like, slightly sort of crow-like looking figure. And she walked up onto the stage and stood there quietly. And then she fixed us all. There must have been about 2,000 people in the tent. And she fixed us all with her eye and said, "All my life, it has been my ambition, my burning ambition, to follow Ken Robinson on the podium." And then she held it just slightly too long, and then she said, "Not." And I'm feeling a little bit like that this afternoon. Anna's a hard act to follow. She left such a legacy of scholarly and, as Rupert has emphasized, practical work across the field of creativity, and specifically creativity in education. She was so prolific, energetic, thoughtful, friendly, supportive, and successful in her work that it's very difficult to know where to start, and I can't begin to attempt to offer a summary for all her works. In a long series of books and articles, she explored the nature of creative teaching and learning, especially in primary schools, her own powerful concept of possibility thinking, the role of creativity in the work of education professionals, creativity and educational futures, and the relationship between creativity, wisdom, and ethics in the book that she and I did with Howard Gardner. It's the latter strand of her work that led to the book with Howard, and it's the one that I would like to pick up today. I'd like to start by reminding us very quickly of some of Anna's seminal thoughts in the area, and then draw some tentative links between that thread and some of my own recent work in the field of embodied learning. Though a committed advocate of creativity and a strong proponent of its place in education, Anna also became, as I did, a critic of some of the superficialities and exaggerations in its application in education. we both became worried about the fetishization of creativity, as if it were self-evidently a universal good, great fun, and the more of it, the better. Just some of the things that, the points that Anna has noted and that I've echoed. Creativity can be used for ill ends, for, we might almost say, evil ends, just as much as it can be used for good. Napalm, complex financial derivatives, new methods of people smuggling, all the products of creative minds, and all bringing misery and injustice to tens or hundred thousands of people. Creativity is restricted to the arts? Clearly not so. Creativity lives just as much in the feet of Cristiano Ronaldo, the experiments of Rosalind Franklin, the cuisine of Heston Blumenthal, the architectural designs of Zaha Hadid, the ventriloquism of Nina Conti, the inventions of Thomas Edison. Creativity is far too important to be restricted to the concert hall or the theatre. Easy and fun? Not at all. Often lonely, risky, and courts disapproval. I'm reminded of a favourite quote of mine from Machiavelli. There is nothing more difficult to carry out, more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle than to be involved in initiating a new order of things. For the creative reformer has for enemies all those who have done well under the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in all those who would profit by the new. This lukewarmness arising partly from the incredulity of humankind, who does not truly believe in anything new until they've actually had experience of it. It can be lonely out there in the front of the pack. We have to beware of doublespeak. Beware of teachers saying that they want it, but in practice only wanting a highly domesticated or anodyne version of creativity sometimes. In some schools, an occasional frenzy of artistic activity, loosely related to a theme such as Medieval Week or the Nativity, acted as light relief from more conventional learning, but often left no mark on the overall culture of a school or the nature of its routine pedagogy. Creativity is inconvenient, mischievous, and potentially disruptive. Would you really have wanted Ricky Gervais and Sarah Millican in the back of your class? In your maths lesson or your science lesson? Perhaps not even in English, unless you were destined to become James Joyce or Irving Welsh. But the issues that vexed Anna, and vex me as well, are also deeper and broader than those. Assumptions that creativity is a faculty that exists independently of specific domains or specific contents, we know not to be true. Usually people are only effectively creative in domains which they know well and where they have a wealth of experience and knowledge. Creativity isn't like a tap you can just turn on and spray wherever you like. The assumption of universal culture-free nature of creativity. No, it isn't. Heavily biased, many versions of it, towards a Western, the term that we use, though increasingly globalized, wealthy, industrialized, digitized worldview, individualistic, sometimes facile creativity that would be anathema to Confucian cultures, for example, sometimes disrespectful, sometimes wasteful, often iconoclastic, sometimes amoral. Divergent thinking is a compulsion to diverge and often to shock. Globalized creativity reduces sometimes reduced to a homogenized backlash against convention. A quote from one of Anna's books: "This universalized approach to creativity nurtures and nourishes a melting pot approach which may unfortunately rub away cultural, political, and socioeconomic differences." And that theme has been around in the discussions this morning. Often harnessed by commercial and economic imperatives of dubious value beyond driving commercial activity. Economies fueled by escalating cycles of production and consumption. The unquestioning necessity of growth fueled by the manufacture of desire for the latest new invention. A book that informed my views very much was a book by a man from Birkbeck College called Nicholas Xenos, called Scarcity and Modernity, where he talks about, in the 18th century, the manufacture of desire by companies such as Wedgwood, Josiah Wedgwood, who, just like Apple today, bring out their new model every year, relegating the previous model to something which becomes affordable to the shires, whilst the latest model is being taken over by the wealthy of the big cities. Creates a culture of neophilia, a word I borrowed from Christopher Booker, fostering this cyclical repetition of discontent, of always wanting something more and newer. Fashion in food, fashion in clothing, fashion in vehicles, fashion in gadgets. The manufactured need for constant upgrading. Reinforces, Anna has argued, and I would thoroughly agree, often a rather narcissistic sense of self, defined in terms of the selection, the acquisition, and then the eventual discarding of material goods and novel experiences. A kind of look at me, I've got the latest, I've had these experiences kind of view. An identity, and sometimes leading to an identity built on envy, competition, and aspiration. A form of self-esteem built on social recognition of style and possessions, not on cultural or ancestral roots, for example. And often, and this, I know this vexed Anna very much, a kind of anti-ecological desire, which follows from some of the things that I've been saying already. The creation of waste, compared with traditional values of frugality and humility. Creativity has often fueled a kind of wasteful and hubristic approach. Creativity is found a lot in much more humble societies, in the ingenious mending and fixing of things. There's a very proud notion in New Zealand that some of you may be aware of, which is often referred to under the name of number 8 wire. Number 8 wire was a particular form of a gauge of wire which a resourceful farmer or shepherd could use to fix almost anything. You'll have seen coat hangers having been used to perfectly effectively replace broken car aerials and so on. Those forms of creativity seem to me to be at least as laudable as those that you might find in Tate Modern. Where those thoughts led both of us was to a real sense of a concern with the nature of value. I've put up a couple of quotes here, one from Ken Robinson, which I'd like to use to kind of lead us into the tricky moral territory of thinking about the value-ladenness, the value base of creativity, and how that concern with values, with the worth of what we're creating, how that plays out, how that infuses into the creative process. And I hope by sharing a few thoughts about that, I can add a little bit and perhaps even anticipate a little bit where Anna's thoughts might have led her as she pursued these concerns, these absolute enthusiastic concerns for creativity, but a real rigorous moral thoughtfulness about the how and the where of creativity, about how it's best implemented. Ken says the process defines creativity as the process of having original ideas, explicitly using the word of having value. I often refer to creativity as coming up with a fresh idea when you need one. And that, again, introduces, as almost all authors about creativity do, this sense of what's worth being creative about and who decides about that. Broadly, there might be two auditoriums, two sources of decision about that. The one that's most commonly talked about is the ascription of value by people who are appraising the quality of the product, of the creative product that you've produced, the journal editors, the board of trustees of an art gallery, the curators in their profession, and so on. But I think I'm interested at least as much in the way in which the decision-making process of value operates within the personal process of creative making, of creative generating. And it's that aspect of it that I want to pursue a little bit more this afternoon. She quotes work from Lubart and I can't remember the name of the other person, something like Monsanto, but I hope it isn't Monsanto, something like that, where she talks about the cultural differences of the creative process and the way in which individual appraisal of the value of creativity is woven in to that process. This is a figure taken from the work of Lubart, I think, where he contrasts what he calls the Western model, although increasingly globalized, I would say, a very venerable model that everybody in this room will be familiar with, that sees the creative process divided into a succession of preparation, intellectually rigorous, reading, discussing, arguing, thinking carefully, followed by a process of incubation, of arriving at an impasse in which logical, rational, well-informed, knowledgeable, conscious, deliberate thinking seems to fail to get you where you wanted to go, and then allowing a process of incubation, a process of not deliberately thinking any further. As the poet Amy Lowell once said, of getting the idea for a poem and then, as it were, posting it like a letter into a postbox, into the darker recesses of her own unconscious, and leaving it there while something interesting happens, while some process of germination happens. And then, if you're lucky, on a good day, moments of illumination, which might be rapid or they might be quite slow, quite gradual, quite subtle, and then back into the world of control, of deliberation, of judgment, of discernment, where you test, verify, and shape what you've produced for consumption. And she contrasts that, or Lubart contrasts that, with a model where there is a preparatory stage, but in that model, the stage of preparation is one of a kind of psychological preparation. It's a process of calming and cleansing, of creating what some recent authors have referred to as a state of psychophysical coherence within your own being, within your own, all the different layers of your mind and body, and we'll say more about body as we go along. So that preparatory phase is not a phase of busy running around looking for things. It's a process of preparing yourself to receive ideas from somewhere, from some other place. In a book on creativity I wrote a long time ago, I can remember quoting a little exchange from one of the Winnie the Pooh books. Winnie the Pooh and Rabbit were walking along one day, and Pooh had come up, you remember he was forever coming up with new hums, and he'd just come up with a new hum. And Rabbit was rather impressed by this and said, and asked him, he said to him, Pooh, how did you come up with that? And Pooh said, I don't know. It just sort of came to me. To which Rabbit replied, because he never let things come to him, but always went and fetched them. So in the Western model, we're busy going and fetching, whereas in the model in many of the Eastern countries, we're busy preparing ourselves to let things come to us. Then there's a process of internal identification, of clarification with the problem. Again, there's a lot of things going on inside you to prepare yourself to produce ideas, not just ideas that are going to make you money, but ideas in some real sense of quality, whatever that may mean. Then there is indeed moments of insight or inklings or intuitions, and the process of communication. But the emphasis on the process in these models is a little bit different. So let me explore a little bit more this idea of the roles of feelings, the role of the non-intellect, the non-intellectual processes in the stages and phases of creative activity. And as I talk about these, I know you will have in mind, as I do, and I'll come back to this later, the way in which schools do or don't allow place for these forms of activity, these ways of knowing which are non-rabbit-like, which are non-intellectual, which are non-discursive, and so on. First, in the early phases of creativity, interestingly, those other two models don't mention this, but of course, creativity begins from an itch, from a sense of dissatisfaction, from a feeling of intrigue. These are all non-intellectual, non-rational, often non-explicit processes. A feeling of oddness or a feeling of incongruence. I can remember when I was writing a book called Harebrained Tortoise Mind, one of the examples that came to mind was a story of someone who, a graduate student, might even have been in astrophysics, might even have been here at Cambridge, I think, who was looking at the printout, the radio printouts from the activity of a distant star, and just happened to notice one small, tiny irregularity which other people had not noticed over time, and which turned out to be the seed of a diligently pursued major discovery in her work in astrophysics. A sense of what I call poignancy, like a something, and you don't know what it is, but something that inspires you to formulate, to go on to formulate a research question, or paint a picture, or write a poem, or write a story. To continue the Cambridge theme, when I was here as an undergraduate a very long time ago, I was a member of a club called the Footlights, of people who put on humorous sketches, and the president of the Footlights during the year that I was involved was a man called Clive James, who some of you will have heard of, who's rather embarrassingly not dead yet, is the way he now describes it. He's been eulogizing his own passing for some time. He took to writing songs with a colleague of his in the Footlights called Pete Atkin that I loved a lot. And I've always remembered, particularly as a romantic young man, a snatch from one of their songs which went, "I've seen a girl hold back her hair to light a cigarette, and it's things like that a man like me can't easily forget." A seed, the seed of a song, the seed of a creative something or other. There's no rational process there. And then during the process, during the evolution, during the gestation, often a feeling, and many people report this, a feeling that somehow as you're going along, as you're making progress, there's a constant process of decision-making, but those decisions that you're making are at that moment unjustified or inexplicable, incapable of being rationalized or justified. There may also be, a part and parcel of that, may be a feeling of wrongness. It's a feeling that someone who I'll refer to later on in this talk, another great influence on me, a man called Eugene Gendlin, refers to rather nicely as "Nyeh." But it's a feeling, you have that feeling in your stomach. It's like "Nyeh," meaning close but no cigar. Not quite it. Not satisfying enough. Not a true answer. It would do, and on a bad day with pressure to meet a deadline, it would do. But it doesn't quite satisfy the itch. It doesn't quite fulfill what you wanted. So that feeling of wrongness is a very powerful guide in the creative process. And then there's something very interesting about knowing when to stop. I mean, when you're involved in the creative process of creating a gizmo, a new kind of something or other, you know you stop when it works elegantly and smoothly. But when you're painting a picture, the moment of knowing when enough is enough, when somehow or other you can't articulate your original intention, but yet as you look at what you've produced, there is a feeling of completion, there's a feeling of closure, there's a feeling you didn't know what it was that you were saying or wanted to say, but whatever you've produced is the best possible way of saying that at the moment. Just a few illustrations of these feelings. First, a couple of scientists. This is Michael Brown, a Nobel laureate in medicine in 1965. I like this expression, which from where I got the guiding hand expression. As we did our work, we felt at times that there was almost a hand guiding us, because we'd go from one step to the next and we'd somehow know which was the right way to go, and I really can't tell you how we knew that. So to anticipate, where is the space for that intuitive judgment in a busy Year 4 classroom? Where is the concern with the cultivation of that sensibility to an inner judge about the quality of your work? Another scientist, Nobel laureate in medicine the following year, Stanley Cohen, said, talking about his own research results, this is the feeling of significance or the feeling of rightness or wrongness. To me, it's a feeling of, well, I don't really believe this result. He has no good reason not to believe it, but it's just a feeling of about it. Or this is an important result, a feeling, I don't know what the opposite of is. Or something like that. Let's follow this path. I'm not always right, and this is very important when we get into the realm of intuition. Intuition is not always right in the way that logical deduction is not always right. Logical deduction only gives you an answer that follows from certain premises. That doesn't mean it's true or accurate or valid. But I have feelings about what's an important observation and what's probably trivial, and I heed them. I pay attention to them. And a houseman, I like this one, and this gets us closer to the importance of the body. He was once sent a letter by an American PhD student asking him if he could define poetry, and this was his reply: I can no more define a poem than a terrier can define a rat. I rather like that. But we both know the object by the symptoms which it provokes in us, and particularly in our bodies. For example, there's one symptom which involves a constriction of the throat and a precipitation of water to the eyes. It's a very learned way of putting the experience of welling up, about which I'll say a little bit more as we go along. And there's another symptom which I can only describe as something going through me like a spear. So let's have a little bit of a look down this list about what I want to offer you, a kind of expanded list which includes within a model of the creative process a broad range of ways of knowing, many of which are not intellectual, many of which are not clearly even conscious, certainly not clearly conscious, but which, if these intimations are helpful and are putting us on the right track, which a sensitivity, a willingness to heed, an openness to these other ways of knowing is essential, or at least extremely valuable in the creative process. Let's start with a sensory motor way of knowing, a kind of the ability to be perceptive, to be attentive, to spot that the girl holding back her hair to light a cigarette, and to see that there was something in that, to spot the wrinkle on the printout from the radio thing. Often in the autobiographical writings of creative people, you often find this interest, this sense of wonder about where their experience, what's going on in this experience. That's interesting. And then that goes into, I wonder why, the sense of curiosity. In schools sometimes, the seed of creativity doesn't come from the children. It doesn't come from the creative person. They're, as it were, given the topic often. It's presented for them. So that very important stimulus, that very important itch that in the real world is the thing that impels you onto the dangerous and arduous journey of creativity, imaginative journey of creativity, that first pressure, that first impulse to pursue the creative journey is kind of taken away from you. It's like, we're too busy. We're going to do Medieval Week or the Victorians or whatever it might be. Then there has to be a sensitivity to the itch, to the feeling of the itch, to taking that sense seriously, which means not skating over things that are itchy or inconvenient or puzzling or problematic to you, but rather enjoying them and celebrating them and drawing them in gently to the center of your consciousness rather than being too busy or shoving them to one side. Obviously, many people speak about this, the power of imagination, the inner theater, the associative play of ideas that Einstein famously spoke about as being the vehicle or the main medium through which his creativity played out. And you'll remember he said in that quote, "These images are in my case of auditory but principally of physical kind." These were images that happened, that came to him through experiences, through bodily experiences. An openness to a kind of resonance. It's like back to the girl holding back her hair to light a cigarette, and that sense of poignancy, that feeling that this is pointing towards, you don't know quite why or how yet, but something in you that wants to be said, that wants to be articulated. Ted Hughes, in a famous book of talks, back in the old days when there was schools radio, he did a series of talks to school children called Poetry in the Making. And in those talks, he once said that, let me get this right, that if we do not learn, that we have to learn the sort of quiet skill of being able to drop an idea or a thought into our own minds, like that letter posted into the letterbox, but this is a more organic one. And as it were, allowing, but his image was of fish in a pond and of allowing the bait, as it were, to kind of sink down into the pond and wait to see what rose to the bait. And that indeed was his working method. His method for composing a poem would often start with something in the middle of a page, if you've seen his drafts, his workbooks. And then you would see ripples of just associations and ideas rippling out from that. And he said, I like this phrase, if we don't learn that art, then our minds lie in us like fish in the pond of a man who cannot fish. Isn't that nice? Yes? So in the busy world of a Year 4 classroom, where do we find the time to learn the quiet art of fishing? You don't learn how to fish by jumping into your waders and throwing yourself into the stream and jumping up and down. That's not the way in which the way the fish will come to you. Use of visualization, obviously, that inner theatre which can be more or less controlled. An artist friend of mine, when I was doing some interviews for a piece of work that I was doing, talked about the fact that as she was going to bed, lying in bed before she went to sleep, she'd cultivated the ability to mentally manipulate a work that she was dreaming about, but she'd learned to be able to kind of deliberately turn things through 180 degrees around or upside down and look at them from the back or the side in her own mind's eye in order to be able to prompt herself with ideas and thoughts to enrich the work. You need the disposition towards experimentation or tinkering, or some people Michael Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, coined the word thinkering, which is a rather nice word. That it is a kind of thinkering, but it's a kind of tinkering and a kind of thinking, but one that again doesn't have that controlled thing. Bodily sensing, and I'll say more about that as we go along, heeding that inner voice, that feeling that you know a good piece of poetry in the same way that a terrier knows a rat, by the physical impulses and twitches almost that it produces in you. A sense of aesthetic appreciation, feeling that this is beautiful, that this is not just efficient, but there is a kind of an elegance, as one electrician might feel looking at a beautiful piece of wiring created by someone else in a house which he's been called to look at. He'll stand and look at that for a while and suck his teeth perhaps a little bit and then just nod quietly and say to himself, nice job. The feeling of the appreciation of creative elegance, creative problem solving at work. The ability to critique yourself, not only the ability but the disposition to be your own first marker, as it were, to have that, foster that sense of rightness and wrongness. Patience and receptivity, already talked about that. The things that were very dear to Anna's heart, the sociocultural referencing, the awareness of what's going on in the field around you and engaging and interlocking with that. Nobody spends more time in art galleries than artists, going there to see what's going on, who's doing what ideas they might be able to nick, and so on. The disposition of social engagement, the willingness to know when and who to talk to about your germinating ideas, and more importantly, who not to talk to. And the disposition of craftsmanship, of the pleasure, the painstaking, slow pleasure of bringing the product to fruition, which involves frustration and further adjustment and further evaluation as you go along. So creative mindedness is a complex orchestration of a whole variety of different ways of knowing, I would say, or dispositions. But let me speed up a little bit and say a little bit more about the bodily side of this, which has been preoccupying me recently. So let me go back to the seeds, those poignant or intriguing seeds of a process, of a sense that there is something that wants to be articulated or made real or made concrete, which you don't yet know what it is. Now, the work of, and here are some more words around down there which kind of refer to what those seeds might be. It seems from the work of Damasio and Imodino Yang and many others that our bodily, particularly to some extent the musculature, but particularly the major organs of the body, the organs that fill the major cavity of the body, are essentially and necessarily and perpetually involved in those appraisals of value. Many of you in this room will be familiar with Damasio's theory of somatic markers, that we tag our experiences to our own benefit continually with the way they made us feel. There is not just a cognitive record, but there is a record of significance, of benefit, of value, which we attach to, which we tag all our memories with. And those experiences of satisfaction or dissatisfaction or irritation or disappointment are emotive experiences. They involve the musculature. They involve small changes in the slant of your shoulders or the tension around your mouth or the feeling in your stomach. These are all involved necessarily in this process. So I want to say a little bit about some work that a number of people have been doing around a process that they call microgenesis. And microgenesis is trying to model in real time, in very short slices of real time, the germination of such a seed. or they might be long periods of time. They might be a relatively quick welling up or unfurling. These are the metaphors that I have developed to describe this process in a book that I'm drawing on today, which I published last year, called Intelligence in the Flesh: Why Your Mind Needs Your Body Much More Than It Thinks, published by Yale University Press last year. And I use a lot of this imagery of a kind of welling up, as when we well up with tears. For example, when you're suddenly unexpectedly touched by an item on the 6 o'clock news, and you feel that you're engaged, suddenly, despite yourself, you're engaged with that piece of information in a way that is not merely, or possibly not even mainly, cognitive. Yet there is a complex and sophisticated form of comprehension and reaction which manifests in Haussmann's tensing of the muscles and a precipitation of water from the eyes, or the feeling of that being about to happen. And in the book Intelligence in the Flesh, I developed the idea that that sense of welling up, which is also the sense that we have with a sneeze, with the desire to urinate, with an orgasm, it's like our physiology is full of that sense, that time-structured sense of something welling up from within us. That process is not just occasional. It doesn't just happen when we're touched or moved by something, but it is actually the way in which all our experience comes to us. But often it comes so quickly that we don't notice the welling. We're only aware of the having welled, so to speak, and not of the process, because often our experience comes to us fast. But I liked the idea that experience wells up in us. And I won't say much more about those metaphors, a little bit, but as we go on. We know, for example, through an example of this welling up process is the idea that or take the unfurling aspect of this metaphor, that as the frond, imagine kind of time-lapse photography of a fern unfurling and then speed it up, so the whole thing happens in the course of a second, let's say, and then slow it down again to see what actually was going on in that process. So the visceral seed begins to take form, it begins to recruit different aspects of our physiology and our mental life, and one branch of the fern might branch out into what you're doing with your hands, and another branch of the fern might branch out into what you're doing with your tongue. But these are all, as it were, manifestations. They're all fronds of the same impulse, the same sense of value of something that wants to be done, something that needs to be said, something that needs to be brought into being. But often, and I'm skipping through the story very, very quickly here, during that growth process, lots of processes may supervene which may or may not preserve the seed of the thing that wanted to be said. Lots of acculturated, lots of conditioned, lots of belief systems may also begin to be recruited, which make the seed articulated, but which may not carry forward the intention of what you wanted. And I use here the imagery of the espaliered tree, the tree that is trained to grow by all kinds of social conventions, conventional use of language, and so on. And one of the jobs of the creative, or the person in creative mode, is to make sure that those unconscious processes of espalierization don't happen to the precious seed of your own intention, that they don't get perverted as they develop in this process. Another thing that happens often when we're under pressure is that we cognitively cut corners. We reduce the cognitive load. We anticipate where the fern is going to go and make it go there, rather than having the patience to allow it to perhaps surprise us by taking an unfamiliar turn, or creating an unfamiliar conjunction or association between ideas. And worse than that, this may happen not only when we're under pressure, but that sense of cutting cognitive corners, of leapfrogging to the usual rather than staying with the authentic, may become a habit. It may become an unconscious cognitive habit, so that we get locked into that habit. I remember the other day, it was a Saturday morning and nothing particularly was going on, and in the middle of brushing my teeth, I noticed that I was brushing my teeth in a hurry, right? For no reason. Yet it was just the way I was used to brushing my teeth, as if somehow or other time was scarce, as if there wasn't the resource, the time resource to do there. So we begin to see what some of the enemies of the creative process might be, or some of the pitfalls might be, in preserving the value, which is my theme for this afternoon. So, again, kind of leapfrogging a little bit in the story, especially under pressure, conscious thought may become a caricature or may lose verisimilitude. As a result, both, interestingly, of stressors and incentives. There's some nice research which shows that even positive incentives can have a damaging effect on creativity, because they create a sense of wanting to do it to get the reward rather than giving it the time it takes. I'm reminded of an old Polish proverb, which I believe says something like, "Sleep faster, we need the pillows." Right? And, or we could go to the Great British Bake Off. Baking a cake takes the length of time it takes. And if you try and speed it up, bake faster, we need the pans, then you're not going to come out with the cake that you dreamed of or that you needed. You may come out with a shrunken and corrupted or burnt representation of what your original intention was. Now, my worry is, and I imagine that Anna would have been worrying about this too, is that the kind of learning, that what goes on in schools, even in medieval week, may be subject to these pressures and incentives, let alone the kind of institutionalized disembodiment that education is built on. Education is built on a Platonic view of the person, a strong split between mind and body, and a celebration, a lionization of mind over body. You just have to look at the amount of time and prestige that different subjects get in the curriculum to get a sense of the fact that something you can do with minimal involvement from your body, for example, mathematics with a piece of paper and a pencil, is prized very highly. Whereas the things that Ken Robinson and many of us in this room are concerned about valuing, dance, drama, physical exercise, and so on, are the things which tend to get relegated down the bottom of the pile. The more body, the worse in education seems to have been the values hierarchy, the hierarchy of esteem in the subjects. And, of course, the egregious neglect of non-intellectualized ways of knowing, which, if I'm right, are absolutely essential, are critical to the creative process. Let me give you a couple of quotes from Mary Imordino Yang, a collaborator of Damasio's, who's been writing, some of you will be familiar with this work, about the role of neuroscience, and particularly Damasio's own research in education. And this is a nice summary, really, of the kind of root challenge to the way in which we've configured what goes on in our schools. Human decisions, behaviors, thoughts, and creations, no matter how far removed apparently from survival in the basic homeostatic sense, nevertheless always bear the shadow of their visceral beginnings. Those visceral seeds are with us constantly and continually, however cerebral the fern may turn out looking. The original seed of the visceral seed is there. No matter how complex or abstract they become, our repertoires of behavioral and cognitive options continue to exist in the service of embodied goals. Emotion plays a critical role in all stages of problem solving, especially creative problem solving, helping the student to evaluate either consciously or non-consciously which knowledge and skills are likely to be relevant. We're constantly making pre-conscious decisions about what to allow into the caricature that consciousness creates. And if we make those pre-conscious decisions wrongly or narrowly or conventionally or hyper-rationally, we're going to exclude from the picture that we work with as conscious minds things that are absolutely of the essence. So, she concludes, we can no longer justify learning theories that dissociate the mind from the body. And that concerns me very much, and it might well be a next book. So, let's get remedial to finish, to finish up with. What gets sped up can be slowed down. What we consciously apprehend can become more accurate, can become a more rich representation of the original intention. Eugene Gendlin, here he is, grand old man, who invented a psychotherapeutic process called focusing, and then out of that, another process which he calls thinking at the edge, which I wrote a paper about in the Cambridge Journal of Education some time ago. Involves a deliberate attempt to slow down this process, to not do the jumping to conclusions, to learn the knack of, as it were, beginning to taste your own unfurling experience at an earlier, less differentiated, but more accurate stage of its evolution. One of his students said, when he was trying to describe what he was on about, he said, "Oh, you mean when there's a lot of umming and erring?" Where we're searching for words, where the words don't come quickly, but we know, we have a feeling that there is a phrase, a form of words, a mot juste, which will get it right, which will give us the rather than the eh. But if we're not sensitive to the then we settle for the espaliered version of our experience rather than the rich and accurate version. These are some students' responses to working with this idea of thinking at the edge, which I rather liked. One student said, it's like a big black bubble type of thing, and little puffs of smoke wafting out that you can catch, something that feels original coming out of my innermost being. Another said, you go blank and stop thinking about something, and then you find it. It's like waking up. This is where your mind's supposed to start thinking, but it shouldn't start thinking before that process. A place inside you where you can just be yourself and release whatever thoughts and whatever you are. This is a primary classroom with a teacher who wanted to build creative mindedness in her children. She made a little cave in what she called the creative corner, which was a quiet spot where the children could go. As a 7-year-old said to me in that classroom, when I said, "What's that all about? What's that for?" She said, "Well, it's where we can go when we want to do something creative, paint a picture, design a new hat, write a poem, do a bit of imaginative writing. It's where we can go and be quiet for a bit so we can let our brains cool down so they can bubble up with new things." Right? That's a fairly sophisticated. She's getting quite close, that 6-year-old, to a richer view of the creative process that we're talking about. But very interestingly, we know that if we can rehabilitate a sense of interoceptive awareness. People do better on Damasio's real-life decision-making tasks, the better they are at monitoring their own heart rate without using any technology or without putting their finger on the pulse. The better you are at that, the more sensitized you are to what's going on in your viscera, the better you are at producing real-life decisions, because those real-life decisions need to be informed by the somatic tags and the somatic markers which attach to the rich compost heap of your previous experience. So what should we be doing? Where should we be heading? Where might Anna and I have been having interesting conversations about these things if she hadn't been taken away from us so early? Certainly thinking about the physiology and putting more physiology into education, actually teaching youngsters about what's going on in their bodies and not relegating the body simply to sport, to the more vigorous or the more extroverted forms of bodily awareness, but cultivating the more introverted forms of awareness. We know that yoga and Tai Chi have cognitive benefits. They have benefits for creativity, for building that sense of psychophysical coherence and elasticity within the body-mind system as a whole, which is conducive to the bubbling up of new things. Having a different view of emotion in the classroom, not as a nuisance, not as emotional intelligence or emotional literacy so often became a matter of dealing with anxiety and anger because they were getting in the way of business as usual. Actually treating the emotionality of learning as something essential, something inherent in the learning. Building a sense and a critically appreciative respect for intuition, for building that sense of allowing the intuitive voice into the conversation about your own learning and what's knowing. The importance of movement and gesture. We know from Susan Golden-Medin's work that gesture often gives evidence in children of more creative thinking than their tongues do. It's as if your tongue conforms to a higher threshold of certainty than your hands might. So if you allow your hands into the act, you're allowing a channel for creativity which is cut off from you if your hands are either neglected or worse, in some of her experiments, you're made to sit on them. A re-estimation of this hierarchy of esteem which relegates vocational learning and technical learning to the bottom of the pile, which is a great mistake. And just a kind of reimagining, a rethinking about what we mean by intelligence. Rehabilitating an idea of intelligence as being essentially about creative and appropriate and effective action, not about being able to produce right answers to disembodied problems under pressure on a piece of paper. And I hope Anna would have had some interesting things to come back at me about on that, and I hope some of you might too. Thank you. Thank you very much.